Hello and welcome to the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm Owain. I'm joined by Dan. How are you doing, Dan?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good. Thanks. Had a nice, easy week after Barcelona half. Although I wanted to do more, just didn't feel that great, to be honest. Legs were okay, but I think I picked Jemima and I had been unwell. I think I'd picked up a bit of a virus. I was fully expecting to with travel and planes and stuff, but I thought I got away with it. That's what was annoying. Sort of built back Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then like Thursday felt rubbish, Friday, Saturday, and just sort of I ran every day, but I think I did like 100k last week, that's fine. It's not a bad time to do 100k, but yeah, get back into it.
Yeah. And at Barcelona, you had some sore kit on, presumably.
Of course I did. Yeah, I had split shorts, and I had the sore socks to go with my Adios. I can say Adios Pro 3s. Getting confused with different podcasts there. With my what did I wear? Asics Metaspeed Sky Parises. It's because they got stupid names in it. But yeah, and obviously I had my sore club vest on as well, repping Ponte over in Barcelona.
Kept you cool in the heat.
I'll tell you what, it wasn't hot, but it felt hot relative to what we've been used to. It was like 10, 12 degrees. Maybe not. I don't think it was that warm.
I saw people on Strava saying this is like, punishing heat, and then you look on the temperature and it's like 11 degrees, feels like 9, and I was like, come on. And also if you're going to Spain for a race, like the reason you're going is good weather, which means it's going to be slightly warmer than the UK.
Yeah. It was perfect conditions. It was perfect. I did throw water and energy drink over myself. Not intentionally energy drink, but I didn't realize it was that. It was in cups as well. I flipping hate cups. At least they were the paper ones that you can pinch a little bit and try and drink something. And I did drink something, which shows you it was warm. I was feeling warm, but yeah, it was good conditions. If someone runs 56 minutes,
I was going to say conditions. I like it when a big record gets broken, because then anyone saying conditions weren't great, you can turn around and be like, well, hold on.
So I broke the half marathon world record by 40 seconds or whatever it was. Like, wow, it couldn't have been that bad, could it?
And I think that's a good link to our interview, because I think the speculation was that Kip Limo used one of the products we're going to mainly focus on. So today's...
Is this your speculation or other people's?
I mean, I've seen it online. I mean, I think, to be honest, any good performance at the moment is being put down to this. Quite a topical subject to discuss. But today we're, in a second, we're going to be joined by Dr. Andy Sparks. He's the Research Innovations Manager at Maurten. And he's also a really well regarded researcher, not just in Bicarb, as you would have seen from the title of the episode, but supplements as a whole. I'm going to correct myself from the interview. On his ResearchGate, he has 147 publications to his name, which is a lot. Me and Dan we've alluded to how much work goes into one publication. And when we talk about it, but when you're researching, especially nutritional interventions, there's a lot of work that goes into it to doing good quality research. But I think if you've read anything, especially around the Maurten Bicarb product, any research, Andy's probably been involved. And now he works for Maurten on their Bicarb system.
So I guess that's one caveat. Obviously, he's going to say it works, but he actually has only worked for Maurten. Did he say for the last year, 18 months?
Yeah, and I think before that, the research,
before that, he'd done a lot of research on Bicarb outside of the Maurten system, and again was found convincing evidence to suggest that yes, it works. He digs into that in the episode. I think it's a really good chat that we have. He's shares some really interesting mechanistic stuff, but also some practical tips as well as how to make sure you get the most out of using it. I thought it was really good. So I hope you enjoy it.
And not just Bicarb as well, but supplements as a whole, because he's been in the space for a while. And we sort of discussed maybe some of the drawbacks as well of the research, and maybe how you can apply it yourself. Like if you're looking at, not just Bicarb, but we sort of said beta alanine was one that we mentioned. how you can sort of, if you're reading a piece of research, how to then think about applying that to your own training. But yeah, no, really, really, really good. Yeah, we really enjoyed this chat, didn't we?
Yeah, definitely enjoyed. So yeah, go and check it out. Bicarb's a hot topic at the minute, so if you're thinking about purchasing it, maybe this will help you help you make decisions of how you should implement it in your own training and racing.
But yeah, enjoy the rest of the episode. So today we are really excited to be joined by Andy Sparks. Andy is the Research Innovations Manager at Maurten. He is also an honorary visiting research fellow at Liverpool John Moores University, and he's previously also worked at Edge Hill University. If PubMed is to be believed, you have 56 publications to your name. So quite a lot of work in not just bicarb, but sort of the whole supplement space, which we're hoping to sort of explore today. But yeah, thanks for joining us, Andy.
Thanks. It's good to be here. Really good to be here.
Before we dive into some of the research, and you just briefly mentioned it before we started, what's your sort of sporting background? Just out of curiosity, really.
Well, I recently found a school report actually, and it was quite ahead of its time in that it had a reflections bit at the bottom. So after you'd been through the mill, you could write down what you thought. And one of the career aspirations for me when I was probably about 11 was to be an athlete. I'd spelled athlete incorrectly though, which is a bit of a shame. And I unfortunately, whilst I was really kind of keen to be good, I was sort of good at everything but not brilliant at any one thing. And it was well before the time of when parents like myself now really try and take their kids and to loads of different activities and try and get them to try everything and see what they're good at. I did the usual things of playing football, playing cricket, and then I got into skateboarding and it all went wrong. And so I went to uni and then got into some endurance exercise out of interest because I was doing a sports science undergrad degree, and that sort of piqued my interest in endurance sports. So I started running, and then I was mountain biking at the time as well. So it was at the peak of the first peak of mountain bike, I suppose, in the very, very early 90s. That's how old I am. And then I got into road cycling. It was into mountain biking, but then really into road cycling through watching the Tour de France actually on TV. That's a bit of a controversial topic at the moment because it's all going behind a paywall, most of it anyway. Really, my main passion really is endurance sports. I'm absolutely average at them, but I really enjoy them. And I I've worked with quite a few athletes, and now I've got a role outside academia, which is sort of allowing me to peer into that world from a different angle, which is nice.
Yeah, nice. And I think that's a nice sort of segue in that. Yeah, you work with Maurten. I think maybe it's safe to say that a lot of the recent work about bicarb has, I don't want to say your hands on it, like you're involved in that. If you look on PubMed, you'll see Andy mentioned as one of the authors. I think you're involved in a lot of the new sort of ground that's being covered with bicarb, not just the supplement but the delivery mechanism, which I think is maybe the sort of the key piece in the last few years, the hydrogel, isn't it? Like getting it into or through your gut, basically, isn't it?
So the sort of background to why I now work for Maurten is that I was an associate professor in education and higher education, and as part of that role I had some responsibility for doing some research, which I really loved. It was really interesting, and we kind of, as a research group, stumbled across an idea based on a paper from Jones from 2014, I think it was, which showed these really quite bizarre at the time individualized responses to taking bicarb in capsules. They looked at a dose response study which was 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3 grams per kilo, and showed huge variability in terms of how people were responding, what time their peaks in bicarb concentration in the blood was, and also some people were getting to really quite ergogenic blood bicarbonate values with quite low doses. And so it was kind of interesting that we'd spotted that and they'd observed it, and it's really sort of what piqued our interest. And we had an undergrad called Pete Miller do an interesting sprint-based study, which we first worked out everybody's individualized time to peak bicarb first, and then we made them do 10 times 6 second sprints with, I think, 30 seconds recovery between each. I remember being a participant for that. It was a nasty one, especially with liquid bicarb prior to one of those trials. It was lively, shall we say.
Yeah.
So that was one of the first studies. That was published in 2016, I think. So, and then from that point, there's been a bit of a resurgence. So around that sort of time as well, Brian Saunders had pretty much finished his PhD at Nottingham Trent, I think, and he published a few papers looking at 110% peak power output, time to exhaustion, and he again showed this really nice response whereby he didn't see a performance improvement until he removed the 4 or 5 people with really severe GI and reanalyzed the data. And then when he removed the people with the worst GI, who are never going to take it anyway prior to exercise because they feel so terrible, he found a significant improvement in performance. And so off the back of that, we were thinking, there's lots of variability. People are responding differently. Some of the GI is very lively, but the timings are all over the place. So this idea of giving it at 65 minutes, if it's a liquid prior to exercise, it might be more ergogenic if we have it spot on the right time. So we played about with that, and we had a couple of PhD students. So we had Sanjoy Deb and Lewis Goff, and they did some, again, nice work. In some cases, sort of looking at some of the previous work which was there, and then not replicating it. One of them was just purely coincidental. There was a study from a Brazilian group which did, I think, 4-kilometer time trials, and they induced acidosis and then they induced alkalosis with a standardized ingestion time, and showed no difference between in performance compared to a placebo. And we did the same thing but with the individualized dosing, just with alkalosis, and showed there was an improvement. And so that kind of got us quite interested, because we thought, okay, actually that was Lewis's study. We saw that and thought, hang on a minute, it might be coincidence, but it feels a bit, it feels a bit too significant to be a pure coincidence. And then Sanjoy did some stuff as well, replicating some work that Andy Jones at Exeter had done, where they looked at a 3-minute all-out test, and they showed no difference. And then we showed, if you individualize the dosing time, there's an improvement in NW prime. So that was again, these things were quite interesting. What is quite interesting as well is that now there's obviously a couple of papers which suggest that the individualized timing is not perhaps as important as we first thought, but there is the sort of the Bergman study, which was that multi-center trial between Canada and Australia, I think it was, with the rowers, that showed 1% improvement in performance in elite rowers. So if you're an elite rower going to the Olympics and you individualize your timing and you're taking liquid bicarb prior to the hydrogel version, then it's definitely worth doing, isn't it? So that was what we were doing.
It's just access to be able to find your own peak time, isn't it? Is you can
and
do
that
that in a performance
problem.
setting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's always the problem. Not everyone's got a radiometer at home in their kitchen, have they? So it's quite tricky. And we were looking at the possibilities of perhaps developing something that would allow you to do that. So we messed about with the idea of measuring pH, because blood pH is a little easier to measure, although you can't use just a standard pH measurement tool for that. But we tried to mess about with whether or not we could get that to work, and it's a bit more variable, so it's not as reliable as a measure as blood bicarbonate. So that's why we would sort of plumb for that. And then obviously we've got quite a lot of variability in sort of the GI responses, and so we then started to sort of work out what's the best way for us to try and resolve some of those GI problems. And so, like Amelia Carr in Australia had come up with the idea of consuming carbohydrate, and if you do that before you consume it, and then also coincidentally, so you have like a gel, or you have some carbohydrate with liquid or bicarb in traditional capsules, then you can reduce the GI upset. So we were looking for like a pharmaceutical alternatives really, and so we played about with this idea of using delayed release capsules or enterically coated, which are a higher grade delayed release coating. And we played about with that quite a bit, and so we had another PhD student who was Nathan Hilton. He did his entire PhD looking at the pharmacokinetics and then looking at the timings and looking at the GI responses and then doing some exercise studies on the back of that as well. Again, we've been able to show some nice improvements in performance with that because of the lower GI. So there's enough evidence there to suggest that bicarbonate definitely works, but it works even more effectively if you don't feel rotten.
Yeah. So all of this is pre-Maurten, I'm guessing, is it?
All this is pre-Maurten, yeah. And so when Nathan was about to finish, we had another PhD student start, Nick Leach, who published a paper 2023 looking at 16-kilometer cycling time trial studies. He's got another couple of papers to come actually. But he published that, and that was on the back of again using enteric and delayed release capsules and showing that longer duration exercise of about 20 minutes was ergogenic. That isn't the sort of the first study to show that necessarily, and I think everyone seems quite surprised that longer duration activity is now sort of on the menu. But there's been work done in the 90s which shows longer exercise can be improved with bicarb. I guess the problem is over that sort of distance it's more difficult to measure. It's more difficult to have a sensitive measurement tool, I guess, in the laboratory. But then also, particularly if it was a running study, the GI upset might be potentially problematic. Yeah. But there's plenty of work there. It's just it seems to have fallen between the cracks. People don't seem to have spotted it, which is good for us and good for me personally. Yeah. It's been brilliant.
I think that's not just related to bicarb, isn't it? I think any studies that have involved longer duration activity, there's a bias towards sprints and power stuff, isn't it? Because it's quick, it's easy to measure, it's easy to get a good marker of like performance. A 6-second sprint, like what do you do? Whereas there's going to be more variability in doing a 10-kilometer time trial, isn't there, or a 5-kilometer time trial?
Yeah, and if you look at the pressures that academics are under to publish, why are you going to go for a half marathon performance when you can do a 5K or even 10K? It's half the time or less, and it's half the lab time, and time is extremely precious, particularly presently in academia. It's very difficult to do this, and there's lots of pressure on academics to publish. So and perhaps that's part of the issue with some of the sports science research is that people sometimes take the easy route to do things because they're under so many pressures to do other things. So and
you want to design a study which is going to give that you think is going to give you a good outcome, isn't it, as well? You don't want to go out too much on a limb. And actually, you might find something, but if you're not convinced your study design is good enough, then why would you pursue that?
Yeah, absolutely. And as an editor is of a journal is like an editor of a newspaper. Essentially, they're partly responsible for bringing attention to the journal, and reporting 10 studies which find nothing. It's not very sexy, is it? And so that's that publication bias, is that you're probably more likely to get a study that is that's published that shows an effect rather than not, and that's extremely problematic for things like meta-analyses, because meta-analysis only includes things that have shown a positive outcome, because the ones that haven't got a positive outcome aren't in the literature because they're not being published. So that's not always the case, although I did once do a study, which I'm not going to identify which one it is, but we found nothing. And one of my colleagues said, "Oh, you're never going to get that published now." And I said, "I bet I will," and I did. But that's exactly,
good though, isn't it? Like
but
you
that
said,
is exactly the point. They should be published because it saves other academics and other researchers going down rabbit holes which they don't need to be going down.
Yeah. I mean, like Dan and I were Dan more involved, but we were involved in a study looking at durability, and the study probably would have failed if someone hadn't messaged Dan with some information, just saying like, "Oh, by the way, consider this.
We tried this, and the intensity was wrong. Like, you may not be able to get through it, and stuff like that."
But that wasn't published. That was just because Dan happened to know the person involved. But if you don't know the person involved, you lose all of this information, don't you? Just maybe quite a big flaw in sort of the whole of academia, that you lose information, and it ultimately wastes resources because three people try the same thing,
I know,
and it doesn't work.
And that's a crying shame, to be honest. I mean, it would be very much more helpful for everybody if more of those studies. I guess that's part of the idea about pre-registration of some studies. So the pre-registration on the clinical trials, you're almost obliged then to potentially publish it. I think JSS have got that as one of the sort of things that they're trying to push forward. I know Grant Abt has been a bit of a champion of that, sort of registering the trial first and then publishing the method and then having a follow-up very much like you would if you were running a clinical trial. So you can see the positive outcomes and then the potentially not negative, that's not the right word, but the ones that aren't sort of showing potentially significant effects. I think that's probably a way forwards really in the longer term.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Can we before we go into any more about bicarb, can we talk about like the mechanism of how is bicarb actually improve performance? Like what's it mechanistically doing? Are you okay to dig into that for us?
Yeah, I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why some of these longer protocols have been a little bit overlooked as well. And I think some of that comes down to this idea of sort of oversimplifying the way that energy is produced. And it's oversimplified largely because, when you're an undergrad student or you're below that level, you're taught the energy pathways and you're taught them sort of sequentially, that you work as exercise time it gets more and more prolonged, you work your way through the pathways to a largely aerobic one, and then energy isn't coming from any of the other pathways at that point when you go past about 5 or 6 minutes. But in reality, all of those energy pathways are active all of the time. It's just their sort of proportional contribution to overall energy turnover is different based on what you're telling your muscles to do. So I think it's really important to make sure that you don't oversimplify things, and I think we're a little bit negligent of perhaps doing that at times, and that means that if they are active all of the time and you don't oversimplify sort of longer duration activity, that means also that you're not making the assumption that doing long duration activity is only going to be at a single unidimensional intensity. It's not if it's outside, as long as it's not on a track, because the reality is that you're going to get different race dynamics, different pacing, you're going to get different topographical changes, and when you get uphills and downhills, the power output from the muscle has to change, particularly if it's uphill. So at various times you're going to be getting different fibers to generate power, and their energy turnover is going to come from different energy pathways. So with that in mind, the traditional view is that bicarbonate is there to buffer hydrogen ions, and yes, that is one of the key mechanisms, but it's also to try and get those hydrogen ions outside of that muscle as quickly as possible in order to sort of maintain the pH inside the muscle. And we know that the presence of those hydrogen ions in the muscle has an impact on contractility. They bind with the calcium binding sites and prevent that from, allowing you to generate power. So you can have as much nerve input as you want, but if those binding sites aren't available, then the muscle won't contract as effectively as it would have done. So that's one of the things. And then the other thing is, of course, is that we now know that it will speed up the rate of efflux, which means that we can get those hydrogen ions out of the muscle quicker. But we can also get the lactate, which is coincidentally produced. We can get that out of the muscle and into the blood, and we know also that that's a really important energy substrate. Gone are the days when we associate that high lactate concentrations are anything to do with fatigue. That they're not. And then maintaining the pH inside the muscle obviously is going to provide better conditions for the rate of glycolysis. So if you look at phosphofructokinase activity, which is a sort of key regulatory enzyme for the rate of glycolysis, if you look at how that works across a range of pHs, as soon as you get to low pH, the rate at which it's active just falls off a cliff. So optimizing the conditions for glycolysis mean that you can turn over more carbohydrate. And so actually this idea of using bicarb, it might also potentially optimize carb turnover, which could be potentially useful if you can now consume very large amounts of carbohydrate. So that's part of that. And then we've done some work recently. Another PhD student of mine, Eli Shannon, published a paper on 40-kilometer time trial cycling. And some of the really interesting data in that is that we showed improved performance for no additional oxygen cost or additional heart rate, and RPE was the same but power output's higher. So that, although we've not confirmed this with any other studies yet, but if that's the case, it would be very interesting because that suggests improved gross efficiency. And so if that is the case, then that would be very, very, very useful to anybody doing longer duration activity.
Do you think that could be through an increased use of carbs versus fat? Through we know that leads to increased efficiency, doesn't it?
Yeah, I have had that question. That if you're using fat, then the oxygen cost is going to go up slightly. So the reality is that that if you're turning over high amounts of carbohydrate, another question I've had previously is, if glycolysis is so effective and it's at a much higher rate, are you going to run out of carbohydrate quicker? And the answer is, I don't know, but probably not in something as long as a marathon, because you'll have fueled hopefully adequately with your feeding strategy prior to the event. And then if you can get upwards of 90 grams of carbs per hour in during, then if you're an elite runner, then the reality is you're probably not going to run out of carbohydrate. But it's an interesting question that we don't necessarily have the answer to at this point. But this has opened lots of additional research avenues because it's highly topical, but also something that we hadn't really considered before. The other mechanism potentially is if you're reducing the amount of hydrogen ions you've got in the blood and the muscle, the chances are that you're also reducing pain perception, because the hydrogen ions will stimulate acid sensing pain receptors. So if you reduce the pain response, then you'll reduce the RPE response, and because you feel more comfortable, you'll probably do more. So it's sort of multifaceted, really. I think lower oxygen cost, improved glycolysis, reductions in RPE all lend themselves to improved performance potentially. Again, this is not preliminary data, because we've published this, but they're very interesting responses. We definitely need to see some more papers on longer duration activity. Ideally, in really well trained people would be brilliant, because they can obviously work at a much higher intensity, a much higher percentage of max as well for longer. So they're the group that we'd really like to sort of do this work in. Particularly, I suppose the benefit of this is that many mechanistic studies previously, they always plumb for recreational individuals, because some of the data collection techniques can be either a bit invasive or really long-winded, and so elite athletes sometimes won't necessarily volunteer for these things. But But with this, you've got a lot of mechanistic information off a finger prick blood sample, so it makes life a lot easier. It's one of the reasons I started doing work on bicarb, is that you can get a really nice mechanistic study of just a finger prick, because it tells you pretty much everything you need to know for that study design. Again, it comes back to that idea of, academics under pressure. Let's find something that's relatively simple and easy to do, but mechanistic enough so you can get it in a good journal. And that's sort of one of those sort of fortuitous things, really. So there's a lot going on. I think some people have not necessarily, they can't get past the idea that it's just for high intensity, short duration activity, because it only does one thing. I just don't buy that.
Yeah. So to summarize that, I guess, is we've got a really good idea of what the mechanisms could be. And it's probably not happening in silo. It's probably some combination of that. But I guess we don't really know the contribution of each of those mechanisms. And I guess we know. Would you say that the ability to increase the bicarbonate buffer and have reduced increased pH within the muscle, or ability to maintain pH within the muscle, is probably the one where most people are talking about, isn't it? I think when you get down to talking about pain perception and pH sensors, that's less established, would you say?
Yeah, it is. But in the medical literature, sodium bicarbonate infusions have been used for quite a long time in anesthesia to improve the rate of anesthetic response. And then they've also been used locally to reduce the sort of pain perception associated with putting cannulas in. So this data is again there, but people have not joined the dots necessarily. It's just, I think we're at a fairly exciting point, really, because I think there's loads of avenues of additional research work that can definitely come from this, especially now we've got a product which reduces the GI upset. It was always a problem recruiting people, because nobody wanted to see whether or not they were the one who had the really bad GI. So it's a little less of a sort of rolling of the dice now. We see such limited GI upset that it's negligible compared to any other method. It's one of the reasons I now work for Maurten, is that they approached me to work on testing the prototypes of the bicarb, because of the work that we've done with the delayed release and enteric. So they joined the dots with that, and so those publications that came out last year, they were actually pretty much completed prior to me working for Maurten. The data collection was all done, the analysis was done. It was the publication that slowed things down, which is, I guess, a bit of a bugbear of many academics at the moment, is the speed at which, or the lichen growth rate of actually getting things published is unbelievably poor at the moment. I think
the whole process takes forever, doesn't it? Like, slightly stepping away from bicarb, but took me 6 months to get ethical approval. And you're just twiddling your thumbs. And that was just for some venous samples. So I can't imagine if I was trying to get muscle biopsies, or it's there's a lot of issues every step of the way, isn't there, at the moment?
It can be, it can be tricky.
With the Maurten product especially, I think there's maybe two bits that stand out when you take it. Me and Dan have both taken it now. It's the capsules of the bicarb, which you're not meant to chew when you take it, but that's coated in this big it's in a big bowl of hydrogel, and I wondered if you could just sort of explain why, for someone that maybe is going to buy the Maurten product, why are they eating this massive bowl of gel or jelly?
Frog spawn.
What does that do? Yeah, frog.
Yeah, I guess it does look a little like that. So it's actually a 2-component product.
Yep.
So you have the sodium bicarbonate, which is in mini tablets, and the mini tablets are designed to pass through the stomach. So they're designed to be small enough to pass through the pyloric sphincter at the bottom of the stomach without having them get turned around too much in the stomach mechanically, so that they're small enough to then pass through. And then the other component is the hydrogel. We actually call it a viscous mix, and that's got 40 grams of carbohydrate in it. So it's designed to provide some energy, partly off the back of that idea that providing energy will also reduce the GI upset. And then also the hydrogel provides some fiber, and so it coats the mini tablets. It allows them to not react as with the stomach acid as you would with a normal liquid or gel bicarbonate. And that is really crucial, because what that means is that you don't lose any bicarbonate in the stomach. If you have a liquid or a capsule which is dissolvable in stomach acid, then you lose essentially a load of the bicarbonate at that point. And that will vary based on how acidic someone's stomach is. It's regulated pretty tightly, but how much time it takes them to actually get that bolus of bicarb out of the gut, into the gut, out of the stomach. That will very much depend on probably one of the reasons why they have different rates of uptake, and so you get these differences in response in the blood. It might also be to do with bicarb transporters, but again, we don't know necessarily. That was one of the things I was thinking about doing next, but it's very complex. Without a gut biopsy, you have to sort of do some screening for genetic screening for markers of the number of and type of transporters that you might have. And that might allow us to work out why there are these differences. Again, not a very practical study, that, because no one can do that screening there at home, but nonetheless it might sort of mechanistically explain why there's that effect. The reason for the sort of hydrogel, though, again, why we think there might be some protective effect and why there's less GI upset, is that you're passing that carbohydrate viscous mix into the gut, likely to have an impact on the gut lining, a protective one, potentially protective effect. But it doesn't seem to slow. It ever so slightly slows the rate of uptake. So if you look at the sort of pharmacokinetic curve of bicarb as a liquid versus the Maurten, the speed of which you get to peak bicarb in the blood is slower with the Maurten product, and it's much faster with the liquid, but the peak is typically not quite as high, and certainly the area under that curve is way smaller with the liquid than it is with the Maurten bicarb. The tail of that curve is longer, it's much higher, so we get a really high peak, but then it also is elevated for quite a long time, which means that the potential ergogenic window after ingestion is really quite long. Whereas with a liquid, it's going to go up, you're going to use some of it, it's going to come down, and it's probably not going to recover too well either.
And I guess that opens it up then to having more potential for longer distance events, doesn't it? If it's going to stay in the system for longer. And because I'd also noticed that with the Maurten system, you recommend to take it 2 hours before you start exercising, whereas other bicarb supplements I've seen, they've talked about 30 minutes an hour. That sort of makes sense, Ben. If it slows absorption but you results in a greater and more sustained peak, then that's going to be beneficial, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty with lots of the bicarbs work that's in the literature is there's almost an oversight in terms of making sure that you account for the type of delivery mechanism that you've got, because they're not the same. They're completely different. In fact, it's very difficult to compare the responses that you get from one delivery mechanism to the next, and that makes doing things like meta-analyses extremely difficult, because you've essentially got a completely different delivery vehicle, and so you're going to get very different performance responses, and you're going to get different blood responses, and a sort of pharmacokinetic availability of bicarb is completely different between each method. So
I guess even if you give them
problematic.
Even if you give them the same dose, if the delivery method is different, then that's gonna affect the bioavailability. Yeah,
that's exactly it. So liquid or gelatin or vegetarian capsules, the bioavailability is much reduced. So the reality means that total delivery is larger if you delay that response, because you're not losing some in the stomach.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So yeah, if we continue with like then more, how would we apply it? So like who do you think is going to have the most benefit from bicarb? Are there certain types of athlete or performance levels of athlete who you think would get a bigger response? So I'm sort of thinking off the top of my head, like is a more fast twitch type athlete who can produce higher rates of glycolysis and potentially have induced lower pH levels within the muscle? Are they going to have more benefit from bicarb versus someone who hasn't got that anaerobic glycolytic capacity?
Personally, I think it's a little early to say. I think it does make sense logically that would be the case. I think if you look across exercise modes, so anybody doing an 800, for instance, is going to be working pretty hard, and that the effect on acid-base balance in that type of exercise is going to be really pronounced. So anybody doing that type of activity is going to probably see an ergogenic effect. Whereas if you're, a 5-hour marathon runner, there's probably no point you taking Maurten bicarb or any other bicarb, because the intensity at which you're working, it is not high enough to really have a massive impact. Whereas if you look at anybody running, sub 4 really, are probably going to be working at times quite intensely, particularly if you've got a course which is quite hilly. If you look at New York, there's a few bridges and there's an uphill finish. So in that type of event, then absolutely you're going to at times be working very intensely. And so if we can provide bicarb and keep it around for long enough, then there's going to be an impact. So like if you look in pro cycling, riders are using it in Grand Tour events for uphill finishes and for sprint finishes. So they're taking it prior to, unless you're Rusty Woods, who took it during the World Championships whilst riding. Yeah, we didn't give those instructions though.
Yeah. I mean, I guess cycling is even more more stochastic, isn't it, than running? And the effect of going up a hill is going to make a difference. But like putting down 5 or 6 seconds of power so you don't miss the break and things like that, like you need to have good peak powers, and you're even mid stage you might be putting in a big burst of intensity just for 5, 10, 20 seconds, which running is more controlled. But like you said, at the end of a marathon, like personally, my heart rate's nearly at max, and I have never measured my pH or my lactate levels at the end of a marathon, but they're not going to be 2 or 3. I'm confident of that.
And if you were to look at your RER, I reckon for the last
100%.
7-8K, it's over 1 probably.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why we sort of
expect so.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why we sort of thought, well, we were doing various bits and pieces of work on when I was an academic, looking at time trial performance in cycling, and looking at like 40-kilometer time trials, thinking these RERs are really high for a really large proportion of the time. Bicarb's bound to work because these athletes are working really hard, and that's one of the reasons why we sort of went down that route, is that if you've got people working really, really hard, even if it's part of that bout of exercise, not all of it, then if you can improve the bit that's really hard, actually you might have an effect on the bit that's not so hard, because you won't spend as much time recovering and you'll feel less bad because it's the people in endurance events that feel the least worst, because you're always going to feel terrible. It's the ones who feel the least worst that and the ones that can suffer the most that typically do the best. If you look at somebody like Tyler Hamilton, in his autobiography, when he's cycling his pro cycling career, he said that the reason he made it was not necessarily because he was the best athlete. He had very average numbers, but because he could put up with an awful lot of pain and discomfort, and so that made him a really good rider because he was able to withstand the pain. So If we've now got a supplement or a product which might reduce pain perception, then that might explain why people are using it and feeling better and going pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I guess in contrast to the shorter events, which are there's less of a psychological input, isn't there? Like it's easy, for want of a better word, to go all out for 15 seconds, 20 seconds, but to hold an RP of 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 for 40 minutes there's more room to play with. There's probably more of a space for increased pain perception to influence performance, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess one of sort of the other questions I had with the application, and you mentioned Mike Woods taking it during a stage. What sort of mistakes do you see people making with Bicarb, whether it's the Maurten product or previously with maybe the more or methods that are more prone to mistakes, I guess. But yeah, are there any sort of mistakes that you see people making where, maybe it's worth avoiding?
With the traditional method of ingestion, often it would be that you get the dose wrong. And with all nutrition strategies, you have to practice prior to any type of event. Getting that right is obviously extremely important, but getting the dose right, getting maths wrong when you're measuring it out yourself is fairly easy to do and can have fairly interesting effects if you get it wrong with it.
Check the decimal point.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Make sure the units are right. Not grams and milligrams. Don't get those confused. That's one of them. The other thing is not eating. And I guess in lots of the supplement studies, you could be a little bit critical at times and say, okay, well, most of them are sort of proof of concept studies in that we want to see the pharmacokinetics. And they often will give an overnight fast, and then you'll come in and take whatever it is. It's not really ecologically valid, that is it? If we're being brutally honest, and I'm guilty of this in lots of the studies I've done. It's the best way to control things potentially, unless you're turning up on people's doorsteps and delivering them breakfast, or you're getting them to come to the lab, which is really tricky to do anyway, and then you're making them stay there for an extra 3 hours while they have breakfast and then digest it, and then you get on with your testing. So that's quite a tricky thing to do. But I think getting the timing right of food intake is crucially important, and then try not to chew if you're having capsules, delayed release, enteric, or the Maurten product. Don't chew the capsules. It defeats the purpose because you're going to lose some in the stomach because you're.
Just to jump back to the eating beforehand. What is the advice there, and what's the rationale for taking on, like you said, breakfast before having your bicarb?
Yeah, so a sort of standardized breakfast often looks like it's around sort of 1.3 grams per kilo of carbs, something like that. It gives enough carbohydrate to top up as long as you've hit your targets for that 24-hour period or so beforehand. If it's a marathon, obviously you're going to be pushing 10. Sometimes athletes go even higher than that, 10 grams per kilo, which is a sizable chunk of carbohydrate. But it's essentially a protective effect. So we see that co-ingestion reduces the chance of GI upset. One thing I will say, though, is that the studies that we published last year on the Maurten bicarb, we didn't give a breakfast, and still we saw really low GI responses, which is quite impressive, to be honest. I know that sounds like obviously it's a marketing ploy on my behalf, but the reality is, that it is impressive because I've just seen so many really terrible GI responses, and we just don't tend to see that at all. And occasionally we'll get athletes coming to us and say, I've had some bad GI. This is what I did. And then when you explore actually what they did, they either not had a breakfast at all, or more likely they've not consumed enough of the hydrogel mix, or more likely they've actually chewed the bicarbonate mini tablets, or they've left the bicarb tablets in the hydrogel for a prolonged period, so they start to dissolve, and so then you're going to get the hydrogel not doing its job essentially.
Yeah.
I guess just, I don't know, a couple more application questions or about the research. I would assume there would be an effect, but is there any idea or any sort of research ongoing into the effect in female athletes of bicarb across the menstrual cycle? I know this is like one of the big sort of hot topics in sports science is addressing a massive gap in the literature base for sort of everything, but is this sort of something that's being looked into at the moment, do you know? Or
I do know, because I have another PhD student. I'm still looking after PhD students. So one of them has done a menstrual cycle Maurten bicarb study, and it's going to go into review hopefully fairly shortly. It's not too much of a spoiler of effect, but there is a slight difference across ovulation and menstruation. There does seem to be a slight difference in the sort of time to peak, but it's fairly negligible. I think the average was about 120 minutes in menses, and then I think about 145 minutes or so. It's not a massive difference. And the reality is that if you were to take it at the recommended time, it seems like a catch-all because of the length of the curve. So as long as it's ingested at the recommended time, I mean, that might have been more that recommended time for the cross-menstrual phase may have been more of luck than judgment, because we didn't have that data at that point. But it does seem to be that there's ever so slightly a difference, but as long as it's taken at the recommended time, I don't think it'll have too much of an effect. So yes, there is work ongoing, and hopefully forthcoming, depending on the review process, and there does seem to be slight differences, but not ones that are likely to have an impact on performance, and not ones that are going to have too much an effect on the ingestion time. So long as it's ingested early enough, it should be fine. I hope she's not going to be upset with me now for telling you
that. We don't have millions of listeners, so you'll be fine. We've got good numbers, but you won't be going out to the world, I doubt. What are your thoughts on using bicarb in training as a way to potentially do more or tolerate higher intensity sessions better? Is it going to affect the adaptation response?
Quite possibly. There's a really nice article on training by Rothschild and Bishop, I think from 2016, I think somewhere around there, and they have a really nice diagrammatic explanation of how various supplements might interfere with or improve training, and bicarbonate is theoretically highlighted on there, partly because if for instance you are able to do more activity, then the sort of metabolic demand of that and the type of energy pathways which are being prioritized or used, we've spoken about glycolysis, might be optimized. If you can do that, then the substrate metabolism is different in that type of activity. It's likely if you're doing more as well, there's going to be more sort of contractile stress response, so mechanical stress potentially. And so that's going to sort of drive adaptation, probably through increased mitochondrial biogenesis. So it looks like AMPK response would likely go up. I think they've got some data from rats which show that's likely to be the case in bicarb. And then also PGC1 alpha, which is this precursor to increased upregulation of mitochondria, that also seems to sort of be affected by bicarbonate availability. But again, in a really, really well-trained group, one, you're not getting muscle biopsies off them, and then two, they're really, really well-trained already, so their sort of room for improvement is much more difficult to actually substantiate than it would be if it was just a recreational or an inactive group that become active and have bicarb or not. And so part of the issue with much of the training data that's there in many supplements is it's often given to, university undergraduates who are a sample of convenience, or it's inactive people who then start a training program. And so sometimes with that you see large improvements, but it's difficult to work out always if it's just the involvement of the training or if it's the actual supplement. Now, obviously, your study design will help you to try and isolate that and work that out. But in reality, it doesn't always mean that we can sort of transfer those ideas into a really well-trained group. Certainly not necessarily elite group. But I guess that's not to say that that at the end of a competitive season, when athletes are having a bit of a rest, that their training status is not necessarily going to decline, because it will. But then if they're, but then actually trying to physically measure improvements, it is tricky. And so often with elite athletes, it's difficult, isn't it, to actually physically get some numbers from them. And as a scientist, often that's what you want. And so sometimes you just have to go on, their self-reporting of how they feel. Do they feel better? Do they feel they can do more? And I think in the literature, we're probably a little guilty of overlooking some of these nuances, in that really well-trained individuals are so well calibrated about how they feel that we often just disregard some of that information because it's not a number. And I think sometimes it would be sensible to actually look at, even not necessarily just one athlete, because that's just you from an academic perspective, you'd never be able to publish one person's perception of how they feel across training period. You might do, but it'd have to be very, very elite person.
I was going to say, you think of that Paula Radcliffe, sort of the Andy Jones work, don't you? Like that's the level you need to do that.
Yeah, you'd absolutely have to do that, and ideally it would be in a group, where you're on a daily basis across the training period, you're getting those sorts of responses. And so it's not to be underestimated if really well trained people say, I've taken this and I feel much better.
Yeah, it's often said, isn't it? But often it's the athletes leading the way in terms of if a new supplement or new technology sticks around in that pool, then it probably works, unless there's some financial investment for them to take it. And if it doesn't, then it's probably not having an effect, because the pace of I guess we've already mentioned about how long it takes to get research published and for the research to be done. Well, actually, the turnover of supplements technology is so much higher in that population. I'm thinking like peloton of a Tour de France or what have you. Like they're not gonna keep something around if they don't think it works.
I always think about
exactly.
Do you remember there was like a year period where the NN team and like Kipchoge was wearing a glucose monitor? And I'm pretty certain he's not now. And I think that was maybe more of a sponsorship, wasn't it? And it didn't really probably do anything, didn't improve their training or their performance, but they were getting paid to wear it. And now, as soon as they're not getting paid, it's gone.
Yeah, the data on continuous glucose monitoring is varied at best, I think.
Well, it doesn't. I think people thought it was going to be a like a battery gauge, isn't it? How much energy have you got left? And the body does so much to defend blood glucose, but it's not telling you about carbohydrate oxidation rates. It's not telling you about how much glycogen is left in the muscle, how much is left in the liver. It's just what's going on in the blood. And you're only going to see changes from your normal levels when it's probably a bit too late and you've run out of liver glucose, haven't you, liver glycogen to break down. But slightly off topic.
I guess just sort of going beyond, I don't know, the evidence base. We've sort of anecdotally heard of bicarb being used in some really, really long duration events. So I say anecdotally, like people like David Roche have sort of quite openly said about it. I think also Killian used it during UTMB. I guess do you have any thoughts on what might be the benefit in those really long duration events? Are they just such good athletes that they are still working at such a metabolically high rate that it is beneficial, but actually someone someone exercising for the same amount of time but not moving as far isn't going to have a benefit, or is there something else going
I
on?
think again there are periods of UTMB which are going to be really, really intense. What's the average time, or the winning times around 19 hours or so, aren't they?
Yeah.
So you're not going to be an RER of nearly 1 for 19 hours. That's pretty, that's not going to happen. But reality is that again, we've got varying terrain. So Killian describes the descents as feeling slightly easier when he was taking the bicarbonate. And that's because obviously if you've seen him on a descent, he's unbelievably rapid. So he's working really, really hard. And then he's obviously having to make lots of decisions. But he just felt that the muscles that were controlling his descending just felt more able to do it. Again, if that is the case, then great. But it's again this idea of a single snapshot of one person's perception, but it's pretty well calibrated. Is if that's what he reckons, then I'm quite happy to believe him, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I guess you're not gonna tell Killian he's doing something wrong when he's running that time at UTMB.
No, he did all right.
Yeah,
he continues to do
Pretty
some
well.
extraordinary things.
Yeah.
I know our podcast is about endurance running, but I was just really curious, just thinking, like, do you know if Maurten Bicarb has sort of moved beyond endurance sports? Is it going into, like the obvious sort of ones are football, rugby, but I was even thinking the other day, I was like, well, a fast bowler in cricket, they're in a T20, they're bowling 24 deliveries at a maximum. They might not be going max sprint speed, but that's 24 high intensity bouts that might be beneficial. Do you know if it's gone beyond, or?
I'm not sure about cricket. Given how popular it is worldwide, it would be great if it was really useful for them. But I think team sports are the obvious one. Combat sports, there's plenty of work looking at repeated bouts in combat sports. Got a couple of papers on boxing. So again, doing those types of repeated bouts with rest periods, combat sports lends itself to. But the traditional method of delivering bicarbonate means that if you've got a sore gut and then you get a blow to your gut, it's not going to make you feel very good. So, but now that if you can now load bicarb without those GI issues, then the reality is that perhaps that's more of an option now for combat athletes. So that's definitely something that is potentially useful for. You identified soccer, so we know that some soccer teams are using bicarb. I can't tell you who, but we know that there are some Premier League football teams, for instance, and some European teams who are using it. It does seem to be that some athletes don't actually want to take it. So particularly footballers, for some reason. I'm not sure why that is. We haven't delved into that, and we certainly haven't sort of made a concerted effort to enter that arena at this point. But I think it might be a cultural thing, whereas endurance athletes will just pretty much do anything if they think it's going to improve their performance. They're quite, they're very low maintenance often. They're just like, well, give me that because I know it's going to make me run faster. I'm quite happy to do it. And I think there's very much a culture of experimenting nutritionally, whereas I think in team sports there's a lot less of that sort of culture of trying new things necessarily. People tend to sort of stick with things, recipes and methods of doing things that are quite traditional at times. Soccer, I think, football is particularly guilty of that.
They're quite a precious bunch, aren't they, footballers?
I didn't really want to say that, but I'll let you.
I'll happily say it. I'm
Um,
not a follower, but I know of people who work in football, and getting them to go to the gym is hard enough, from what I've heard. So
yeah, I
uh,
think just getting them to experiment a little bit, I think, can be potentially tricky. But I think, I think once people realise how good it is and how good you can feel, then I think that might well change. Rugby again would be particularly useful for potentially, but again, traditionally it was never used because of the impact. So, and now obviously that might not necessarily happen. So, yeah.
yeah, it does seem that like the new delivery mechanism has opened up a world for the products, but also for doing the research as well. Like you could feasibly go and do a team sport like rugby, combat sport, bicarb study in higher level athletes
Yeah,
and find the effects. And again, in the longer duration, like hour plus,
yeah,
um, hour plus events. And in running versus cycling, where there's obviously more risk of GI distress in running,
yeah,
like that previously there was a lack of research, and now hopefully we'll start to see what
yeah.
the effects are there. I mean, in terms of the endurance events, what sort of percentage improvement would you typically see, and what is the individual variability there? Like in a aside of like the GI distress or discomfort, or hopefully lack of, like, is there a big range in responders and non-responders, and
Yeah,
yeah.
in the Shannon study, the average is 1.3% improvement, but some people were down at, I think, one, and others were up at 2% improvement. So there is variability within that. Again, I am not sure why that is. It might be to do with just the sensitivity of measurement. Potentially, the retest reliability might have an impact on that. Um, but when everyone's improving pretty much or staying exactly the same, your measurement error in that sort of 40-kilometer time trial is likely to be less, a good bit less than 1% in really well trained individuals who are familiarized. So, I'm pretty confident that those improvements are pretty substantial, really.
Yeah.
And that sort of value is what we'd expect in the sort of 16-kilometer time trials. Potentially, 2% is not unreasonable, but it's likely to be between 1 and 2% realistically. But if you said, or if you take this prior to doing your season's goal event, and you'll improve it potentially by 1 or 2%, if you take this, then most serious athletes or anybody who's a bit keen is going to go, well, that sounds like a good idea, because actually that's a substantial amount of time potentially, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean the amount of training you'd need to do to get 1%, 2% better is very substantial. It's actually it's the same with the shoe technology in running. Actually, it's yeah. People think I don't want to spend £200 on a pair of shoes, but that's going to make you 2 or 3% faster. That is a very easy way of getting your times down.
Yeah, it's interesting, that approach, isn't it? I mean, lots of, when we work with athletes, we obviously advocate a food first approach. And so there's obviously lots of potential improvement to be gained from getting food intake right and fueling right initially. But then if you add on top of that an optimal ergogenic strategy, then the potential improvement is really quite substantial. It really can be considerable.
I wanted to, we sort of touched on sort of the wider I guess wider science and wider nutrition field, but I just wanted to sort of just ask you about sort of your experience, because like we said in the start, you've done a lot of research on bicarb, but you've also delved into some other supplements or things that people are taking, and especially in endurance sport. I guess quite a broad question, but what do you think science does well and does less well when it comes to like nutrition research? Because I think we see like bicarb's the sort of hot topic now, but it was beetroot a few years ago that was sort of the big thing. And up till recently, I was working in a running store, and you'd still see like random people coming in and just buying like 10 beetroot shots. And I think maybe when you actually delve into the evidence base, it's not just quite a clear like beetroot works. There's quite a lot of nuance to it.
It depends how much nitric oxide you have, or nitrate you have in your diet.
Yeah.
And that's probably why in really, really well-trained people, there's less room for improvement with nitrate, because they've probably got their diet a little better. Plus, how much perfusion can you have? There's got to be sort of an upper limit of how many blood vessels can be dilated by it, because, if you're really, really well-trained, then, it's going to have probably less of an effect, I think. If you're a club runner though, and your diet is slightly suboptimal, then is it going to have an effect? Probably. I think I think for me that one of the things that we don't do brilliantly is test and publish enough data on really, really well trained people. And that again potentially sends people down a rabbit hole they don't need to go down. But I think there's this perception in the sort of sports science and nutrition, I call it an industry, but the sort of support staff, that reporting any data on athletes, even if it isn't commercially sensitive, it is almost sort of giving away some trade secrets, which means that they're not willing to necessarily do that. I mean, it might just not necessarily be, too much of a priority for them, but I think it would be really good if we published a little bit more. I mean, Trent Stellingworth is really good at doing these sorts of neat little case studies on small numbers of really elite athletes. He's done quite a few. Did that really risky one where he measured his wife's weight over time over a career and published that.
Does sound a bit risky, doesn't it, from a marriage relationship point? But that was but really interesting to see that sort of data.
That did make me chuckle. So that sort of data, I think, especially if it's not that commercially sensitive, I think would be much, much, much more preferable. I think it would open up loads of different avenues of investigation, and it's just really super interesting because many people don't get to see any of that data at all. So, I think we need as a discipline to do that better. What do we do poorly? Publish too many studies, I think, with low sample sizes. And I think that's not very helpful. I think it's very, very difficult to get funding to do this type of work. And so there is this criticism, isn't there, that, that study was just, it was supported by X company or Y company. The reality is that if you don't end up with those sorts of industrial links, you're almost certainly not going to be able to publish some of that work, because you just won't have the finances to pay for simple blood analyses. The studies that we've done previously on Bicarb, they're really expensive to run. Each single sample is probably about £7 to analyze. And so if you've got 15 people and then you've got a time to peak trial and then multiple time trials, you're talking thousands and thousands of pounds just on the bloods, not counting the time, the lab availability and everything else you want to do, and access to gas analyzers and all that sort of stuff. So it is really, really expensive to do and time consuming. I think it's a real shame that we have this sort of not potential negative perception of it, but people are a little bit more skeptical of things when they're supported by industry. I think you have to rely on the integrity of the scientist and then look at the sort of conflict of interest statement and actually look at what the relationship between the industrial partner was like. I think if you get in with a good one, they won't interfere too much at all. They'll have probably a general chat to begin with about the study design, because they'll want a study design which is appropriate. And I think that might be a bit of a criticism of some of the hydrogel studies that have been done previously in carb oxidation, is that the energy intensity is just too low. And so they say, hydrogels don't work. But, if you've got someone working at 65% of max, well, it probably isn't going to work because there's no GI and the intake doesn't need to be high. So, we get into this sort of situation where we're a bit skeptical about that stuff, and that's a bit of a shame, because it's one of the reasons why I left academia, because it's just so difficult to get money in to actually fund this work. It's really difficult, on top of all the other things that you have to do. So I think that the small sample size is one thing, but sometimes that's out of necessity, again, because you're in a position where sometimes you're forced to publish. It's in people's performance reviews. You have to publish a paper a year. That's just madness. Let's focus on quality work rather than volume. That would be the sort of the bugbear. And then off the back of that, we mentioned meta-analyses. I think over-reliance on meta-analysis for me is a problem. If you put poor studies in, you're going to get poor conclusions out. And if half of the data that's actually there but it hasn't been published is missing from the meta-analysis, then you're going to go down a rabbit hole again. So everyone, in the wider media report meta-analyses is like the gold standard study. They're not. It depends what you put in, and it very much depends what your selection criteria looks like as well, because many of those studies might be just selectively not included. So there's lots of that sort of stuff that I think can happen. I'm not saying it does, but there is a bit of a word of warning there to not be over reliant on those.
Yeah. What about the looking at the interaction between multiple supplements at once, right? Because going to a real world example of working with a professional endurance athlete, they're not just going to be taking bicarb in isolation. I'd imagine they're going to be taking it probably with caffeine. You mentioned earlier in the podcast actually about, is there an interaction effects of taking the bicarb as well as really fueling the race you're doing as well? So what's the interaction effect there?
Just to hop in here, like just quoting one of your studies back to you, Andy.
Lovely. I love it when people do that.
Looking at swimmers and the supplements they take. And I'm just going to read off the list because just for listeners, really. So this was the ergogenic supplements that swimmers reported taking. So you've got beetroot juice, beta-alanine, caffeine, and that's split in between drinks and gels, and then just caffeine powder, citrulline malate, creatine monohydrate, and bicarb. And imagine if someone's taking all of those at once. How do you know what's
they're not all going to work?
Yeah,
I think the lesson is they're not all going to have a performance enhancing effect, and it's not going to be additive. So you're not going to get 1% off everything.
Yeah.
It's
a shame, that, isn't it? You could just eat yourself fit, couldn't you?
Yeah, it would be brilliant if that is actually what happened in the real world, but I think what's key there is to think about potential mechanisms. So the citrulline malate one and the nitrate, the potential mechanism is largely going to be about the same. So it's one or the other, and then if it was one or the other, then the evidence for citrulline malate is much more mixed. And it depends on the ratio between citrulline and malate in the product that you're consuming. So that's going to be different. And then if you look at sort of something like polyphenols and anthocyanins, that there's so many of them, you're probably better off just to make sure that you have a very rainbow diet, because the likelihood is then you'll have enough from just natural food sources to have an effect. I mean, there is some nice data, I suppose, on tart cherry juice. It depends how you classify recovery, I suppose, but there is some data to show improved recovery with that. There's some interesting stuff as well on quercetin in terms of looking at like really intense training and reducing the potential for upper respiratory tract infections. So I think it was David Neiman did some work in the early noughties looking at, if you load with quercetin prior to a really intense bout of training, you can reduce the number of and the severity of upper respiratory tract infections, which is, I suppose, quite interesting. And then beta-alanine and bicarb work differently. One's intracellular, one's extracellular, and again, the data that's there is very mixed. There doesn't seem to be an additive effect where you get a multiplication of performance improvement when you take both. It seems to be that you kind of pick the one that you think based on your training and your experimenting personally, the one that you prefer and the one that you think works best for you. I think that individualized approach is important and shouldn't be sort of overlooked. Yeah, the caffeine again, I suppose, during exercise anyway, it can reduce pain perception, improve potentially muscle recruitment, I suppose. And back in the day when I was a PhD student a long time ago, the proposed mechanism for caffeine was improved rates of lipolysis, which is what you do see, but that's not the performance enhancing effect. It's improved contractility and muscle recruitment and a pain issue, so reduced reductions in our RPE, which is particularly important in endurance exercise in the sort of latter half when things get a bit grippy. So yeah, I guess we should investigate these a little bit more. And I suppose the problem with doing these sorts of studies where you have co-ingestions is you end up with so many trials that it becomes very difficult to recruit people to, and so you end up with quite small numbers. And then if you've got 5 or 6 trials, then and you've got small numbers, and you've got a bit of a heterogeneous sample, so not everyone's really well trained, or they're a bit of a mixed bag, sample of convenience. Actually physically measuring differences between these trials is so difficult unless you have a really large sample size, and invariably in our discipline they're probably a little bit low, particularly for a study like that where you've got multiple trials. Maybe if you've got interaction effects across 2 different supplements, you've got them combined, you've got them individually, and then you've got a placebo for each, and then you've got also adequate familiarization. So that's at least 2 or 3 trials,
you can see
and
why
that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's too extensive.
That would be the other thing, is that that from a field perspective is this idea that people are familiarized with the activity. Are they really? Because actually you probably see more of an effect if they're fully familiarized, but that in itself is almost a study, because it might mean that some people have to come back and do their trials 3, 4, 5 times, and if that's a 10k or a half marathon, for instance, they're not going to do it.
No. So how do you get brought into working one-to-one with Maurten sponsored athletes, or are you very much from a research and advisory side of things?
Yeah, so we have Tobias Christensen, who's the head of nutrition. He does lots of hands-on work with the athletes, and then we have Josh Rowe, who works with the athletes as well. And then we've got Lauren, who you spoke to in one of your last podcasts. So Lauren works in the US. And then we've got as well Ben Vreens, who works. He works in Holland. He also works hands-on with some athletes. So it's a mixed approach, really. I step back, and my role is slightly different to that. So at the moment, I'm not doing that.
No. Cool. Sure, I think we need to start wrapping this up, don't we, soon? Owen, have you got any last questions you'd like to put to Andy?
I didn't. Did you? Do you have anything, Dan? Or
no, I think we've had a really nice, pretty good deep dive into bicarb, and no, it's been really interesting. So thanks for coming on, Andy. I've really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. It's been enjoyable.
Good.
Good. Is there anywhere people can follow you if they're interested in more? You mentioned some research coming out. It's kind of hard to follow research, isn't it? You sort of need to be on like ResearchGate, I guess. But
so yeah, ResearchGate, where there's considerably more than 56 papers.
Oh, okay.
The problem is that my first name is actually begins with S. So I've got about 3 or 4 different publishing names, so it's all weird. So it means that that number on PubMed is not quite right. There's a good bit more than that knocking around. But that's fine. PubMed is like the gold standard, I suppose, at the moment anyway. And ResearchGate or Twitter or whatever it's called at the moment. I only tend to post other people's research, or occasionally when mine gets mentioned by somebody. I'm not that active on that anymore, but that's perhaps a political statement.
Nothing wrong with that. No, great. Well, thanks for coming on, Andy. I'm sure our listeners have found that really interesting, and yeah, really nice to continue of the theme we had with Lauren. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
Great. You're welcome. Thanks.